Today we're diving into one of the most tangled, emotionally charged conflicts on the planet. And what you find when you really dig in is that this isn't just a fight over a piece of land, it's a fight over the story of that land. Two completely different histories, two completely different truths unfolding in the exact same place. So let's get into it. You hear it all the time, right? That this is some ancient biblical era conflict, that these groups have been fighting for thousands of years. But is that actually true? Well, not really. And, this quote from Vox just gets right to the point. The political conflict we're talking about today isn't about ancient religious hatreds. It's actually pretty modern. It's about two national movements, both born around the same time, who see the same piece of land as their rightful home. So here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at those two competing stories. Then we'll trace the history from the British Mandate all the way to the occupation. We'll get into the uprisings and the failed attempts at peace. And then we're going to look at a view that challenges that whole historical narrative. Finally, we'll see where things stand today. Okay, so this is really the foundation for everything else. You can't understand the headlines or the violence if you don't first understand this fundamental clash of two different peoples, two different dreams for the same land. So picture this, it's the early 20th century. The old Ottoman Empire is crumbling, and in that vacuum, two big ideas start to take hold. On one side, you have the Arabs living in the region who are starting to see themselves as a distinct people, Palestinians. And at the exact same time, in Europe, you have the rise of Zionism, a movement arguing that Jews aren't just a religion, they're a nation. And after centuries of persecution, they need a state of their own and their ancestral homeland. You can already see how these two ideas were headed for a collision. All right, let's jump into the timeline and see how these two national dreams started to clash in the real world, creating the map we see today. So after World War I, Britain's in charge. And in 1917, they issue the Balfour Declaration, basically giving a green light to a Jewish national home there. This sparks huge waves of Jewish immigration from Europe, which, as you can imagine, leads to major tensions and violence with the local Arab population. Things get so bad that by 1947, the UN has to step in and says, okay, let's just split the land in two. The Jewish leadership accepts, Israel declares independence in 1948, and boom, they're immediately invaded by their Arab neighbors. And then the next huge shift happens in 1967 with the Six-Day War. That's when the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza begins, and that really defines the conflict to this day. Now that UN plan, let's pause on that for a second. This number is a huge deal. The plan gave the majority of the land, over half, to the Jewish state, even though Jews were only about a third of the population at the time. This was a key reason why Arab leaders flat out rejected the plan. And that rejection is what led directly to the 1948 war. And the outcome of that war? A decisive win for Israel. They ended up with way more land than even the UN had proposed. But for Palestinians, it was a total disaster. Over 750,000 people were forced from their homes. To them, this is the Nakba, or the catastrophe. It created a refugee crisis that, still hasn't been resolved. So after 1967, the whole nature of the conflict changes. It's not so much about Israel versus other countries anymore. It becomes about Israel's military rule over Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, in this brutal cycle of occupation and resistance that just keeps going. And life under occupation, it means living under Israeli military law. It saw the rise of the PLO, the main group fighting for a Palestinian state. And crucially, it's when Israel started building settlements on land that was captured in the war. At first there were a few, now there are hundreds of thousands of settlers living there, and pretty much the entire world considers those settlements illegal. By the late 80s, all that frustration and anger among Palestinians just exploded, and it became known as the First Intifada, which is Arabic for uprising. It started out with things like boycotts and protests, but it quickly spiraled into a much more violent conflict that would end up, surprisingly, forcing both sides to start talking. And those talks led to this, the Oslo Accords in the 90s. For a moment, there was this incredible sense of hope. The idea was to create a Palestinian authority, to give Palestinians some control over their lives, and then they'd figure out the really tough stuff like Jerusalem, refugees, and settlements down the road. But extremists on both sides just went to work, using violence to blow the whole thing up. After a final failed summit in 2000, all that hope was gone. The trust was just shattered. And what followed was the Second Intifada, which was just way, way bloodier than the first. The sheer scale of the violence changed everything. For many Israelis, it was proof that they had no partner for peace, and Israeli politics swung hard to the right. For Palestinians, it brought this deep, deep despair, a feeling like nothing worked. Not talking, not fighting, nothing. Okay, so we've just walked through the standard historical version of events. But, and this is a really big but, it's absolutely crucial to understand that this entire story we've just told is completely rejected by some. So let's take a look at a perspective that doesn't just argue about the facts, but challenges the basic words we use, words like Palestine and occupation. This quote from Mossab Hassan Youssef just cuts right to the heart of it. The argument here is simple. You can't occupy a country that was never a country to begin with. Since there was never a sovereign state of Palestine, this view holds that the term occupation just doesn't apply, legally or historically. And you can see the total rejection of the world's go-to solution in this quote. The two-state solution isn't just seen as difficult, it's presented as fundamentally absurd, an idea that's completely unworkable from the start. This view completely flips the script on what happened in 1948. The argument is that the Palestinian refugee crisis wasn't caused by Israel. It was the direct result of a choice made by Arab leaders, the choice to reject statehood and declare war, instead of building their own state next to the new Jewish one. So after all that, where are we? Well, we're stuck. We're left with a conflict that's not just about borders and security checkpoints, but about two fundamentally opposing truths, with seemingly no middle ground. So let's be real about what things look like right now. In the West Bank, you have what many describe as a smothering occupation, with settlements that just keep growing. In Gaza, you have a crippling blockade and devastating wars every few years. Inside Israel, for a lot of people, the conflict is something that feels managed, not a problem that needs to be solved. In a real peace process, it's basically dead. And that's really the heart of it. This isn't just a fight for physical territory anymore. It is a battle for the narrative. Each side has a story that justifies their own claims and completely delegitimizes the others. And as long as those stories can't coexist, nothing else can. Which leaves us with a pretty daunting question, doesn't it? When two people look at the very same events and see completely different things, one sees a story of liberation and return, the other sees a story of catastrophe and occupation. How on earth do you even begin to build a common future?